Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our FindLaw.com Legal Answers webinar on the 2020 election, who won, who lost, who sued, and why. I'm your host, Bridget Molitor, and I'm a senior editor with FindLaw.com. With me today is our featured speaker, David Schultz. David is a nationally recognized expert on election law, and his commentary is frequently sought after on election topics. We are truly grateful to have him here for his time today. He's been pretty busy the last 2 weeks. I also want to really take some time today to thank all the veterans here who are joining us. Thank you for your service and happy Veterans Day. Okay, before we bring David on, I have a few housekeeping items and introductions to go over. First, you might be asking, what is FindLaw.com? FindLaw.com is the world's leading provider of free online legal information. Every month, more than 11 million people visit FindLaw.com to seek answers to legal questions. Our mission is really to make the law accessible for everyone, with thousands of legal articles on a wide range of legal topics, including topics we're discussing today, voting rights, and then also civil rights law. We also host the world's largest searchable lawyer directory with qualified local attorneys across the country. All right, during this webinar, we will be recording live, but all of you are on mute, so don't worry, we can't hear you. You can send questions via the chat option. It's either in the lower right-hand corner or in the center of your screen. We ask that you keep your questions professional and then remember that we cannot provide legal advice. We'll get to as many as we can at the end here, but we won't be able to get to all of them. Once the event is over, we will share it via social media and email, so we ask that you watch for that and feel free to spread it to your friends who might be interested. Also, we'll have a survey, and if you could please answer that, that would be helpful for us. Lastly, don't forget to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and we frequently post and share exclusive legal content that connects you directly to our website. Now, it is my truly great pleasure to introduce Professor David Schultz. As I mentioned before, David is a nationally recognized expert on election law, but he is also an expert on professional ethics and state constitutional law, among other things. David is a professor of political science at Hamline University and an election law professor at the University of Minnesota and the University of St. Thomas Schools of Law in the Twin Cities. He is also the author of, I think, 30 books at this point, including the book Presidential Swing States, which is a groundbreaking book that explains why the vote in some states determines our presidential election. All right, so live from St. Paul, Minnesota, here is David Schultz.
Great, Bridget, and thank you very much for having me, and thank you to all the audience out there. And what I want to do today is, as the title says, 2020 election, who won, who lost, who sued, and why, is this is sort of going to be a post-mortem, I think sort of a post-mortem on the election, although I say sort of because it doesn't seem to be quite over yet as of today, which today being, what, the 11th of November. But I want to talk a little bit about sort of understanding what happened in the election. And what I'm going to argue is that there are several themes that run through this election this year that are connecting the pre-election to the post-election. And among those themes I'm going to talk about today is one is about how we entered this election as a very divided country, that is the United States, and we seem to be exiting the election as a very divided country. So I'm going to talk about how that polarization and division has really defined significantly the election cycle this year, especially at the presidential level. Second, I'm going to indicate that, again, as of today, 11th of November, the election is not quite over yet, and technically the 2020 elections won't be over for several weeks, in the sense that we still have to wait for the Electoral College to meet and to cast its votes, which won't come until December 14th. We still have to wait for what? Congress next year on January 6th to actually meet and ratify or verify the electoral vote. And then this year also, because of the 2 runoff elections in the state of Georgia, which could very well determine control of the U.S. Senate, that won't happen until January. So for a variety of reasons, we can argue that, guess what? The elections aren't quite over yet. And then, of course, we'll work into this, the post-election litigation that seems to be going on right now. So second major theme is the elections are not quite over yet, and technically we have several weeks to go, which is typical of all elections. Third, And this is the one that's going to surprise you completely when I argue that one of the other themes this year is that what happened this year was entirely predictable. That in fact, the election cycle and what has happened, we knew it was going to happen. And that one you're going to be really puzzled by. And then somewhere in here, I also want to talk a little bit about what sort of the legal options. And what I mean by that is that we know that the Trump campaign has indicated that it plans on multiple lawsuits, of which is already filed, with the hope that perhaps it can litigate its way into a favorable ruling. And let's talk a little bit about what that litigation is starting to look like and assess some of the prospects. All right, in order to do this, again, Bridget had mentioned that I did a book called Presidential Swing States. And the first edition came out about 5 years ago. And what the whole premise of the book was about at that time, and it came out in early, I think, October of 2015. And what I argued back then, along with my co-authors, Stacey Hunter Hecht, was that the presidential election back then for 2016 was largely over in 40 states well before it started. And what we meant by that is to say that because the fact that the election is not a national popular vote, it's decided by the Electoral College, which makes it immediately a 50-state race plus the District of Columbia. I may just refer to it as 50 states. It's easier here. Second, because in 48 of those 50 states, the electoral votes are allocated in a winner-take-all or all or nothing fashion, whichever words you prefer to use. And because of the polarization, that is because of the fact that not every state in the country has an even balance of Democrats and Republicans. We knew back then that some states were more likely to go Democratic as opposed to Republican. We had prophesized or guessed or argued, whatever verb you want to use, that, for example, we knew what was going to happen in New York, California, Massachusetts. These were states that were reliably Democratic or Democratic Party. We knew that places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Utah were likely going to go Republican. So what we argued back then, that there were only about 10 states that mattered. We argued that within those 10 states, which we called the swing states, that about 10% of the population would really decide the election. So in 2016, our argument was that the race to 270 being the number of electoral votes you needed to win the presidency, that the election came down to three really lovely numbers: 10, 10, 270. 10% of the voters located in 10 states would decide who gets to 270. And at that point, we were saying that because of the polarization, the election was probably down to no more than maybe 300,000 voters that would really matter. Well, that was 2016. Late 2019, I was starting to think about the third edition of my Presidential Swing States book. First edition came out before the 2016 election, second edition after. I started plotting for the next edition of that book to come out after the 2020 elections. And this is last December 2019. And I was trying to decide, well, what states should I consider putting in this book? Because it's an edited volume and I like to get experts on different states. And so again, December of 2019, I looked at the polling data and I made several assumptions back then. One assumption was, of course, that it would be Donald Trump and Mike Pence that would be the Republican nominees. I also said back then, either by dumb luck or by good guess, or maybe I should say by good research, I'm not sure which it is, that in fact it would be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which would be the ticket. And I was pretty sure that was going to be back then. If the election were held last October 2019, what would it look like? My argument was that the presidential election was over in 43 states. That my argument is that we knew what states were going to go Democrat. We knew what states were going to go Republican. What I argued back then in putting together notes for myself is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would start with 222 electoral votes in the bank. That Donald Trump and Mike Pence would have 205 electoral votes in the bank for them. That neither of them were at the 270 mark, and that the balance of power would rest with what? With 7 states. 7 states with a total of 111 electoral votes. These 7 states would decide the 2020 election. Those states were Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Again, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, totaling 111 electoral votes, and we argued those would be the 7 states that would really decide the election. This is where the candidates would be, where they would campaign. Now, I did also throw in for the heck of it, because I started to seeing some evidence that maybe Georgia might be getting close to flipping. Although I didn't think it was going to be this election cycle. I thought maybe 2024. So I said, okay, let's maybe think of Georgia as another possibility. And also because in 2008 in Nebraska, Barack Obama won Omaha. Omaha area is a separate congressional district. Nebraska and Maine are the only 2 states in the country that do electoral votes, not on winner take all, but by congressional district. I said, let me throw in Nebraska as a possible swing state also, because part of the state might swing. So this was my argument. My argument was going to be these 7, maybe 9 states that would do everything. But then I said, what we know is within all these critical swing states, there are certain counties that really are drivers, that the turnout in these counties, the demographics, the numbers really decide the presidential election. For example, in places like Pennsylvania, it would be Philadelphia County or Bucks County, right near Philadelphia, or maybe an Allegheny County, Pittsburgh area, or Susquehanna County, which is where Scranton is as a good bellwether. North Carolina, it could be Wake County. Michigan, it could be Wayne or Oakland County. Arizona, it could be, for example, Maricopa County. The point being, there were certain counties that were really the drivers. And guess what happened? Getting into the general election this year, those 7 or so states exactly played out the way we thought. They were the states that were where the candidates were campaigning. That's where the focus of the dollars were. That's where the focus of everything was going on. So in that sense, it wasn't that small cluster of states. What I argued then also I said within those states that it was going to be, again, a certain number of counties. And again, with that, I said within those counties, only a small number of voters would decide the election. So again, a year ago in December, I said that the 4 numbers you really needed to really then know were what? 10, 11, 7, 270. 10% of the voters located in 11 counties distributed across 7 states would determine who win the presidency. That was, remember, December of last year. This general election, it largely played itself out during the general election early on in terms of what? Those few states. Looked at where the candidates were campaigning, looking at the counties where the candidates were going. They were keying in on those areas. So all this was playing out, leading to the sense of what? That it was an entirely predictable election. It was predictable. Why? Because of the intense polarization that we have, that we rarely have split ticket voting anymore, or people cross ticket balloting, or any of the characteristics that we used to associate with our voting being more fluid. It had become much more rigid. We knew that regions were far more rigid in terms of voting. In fact, this is kind of a humorous story here. I could tell you that if you looked at 2016, for example, looked at where Democrats did well versus where Republicans did well, and put that on a map of the United States, a detailed map, and then plotted Republican areas and Democratic areas, and then also put in the location of what? Whole Foods, grocery stores, Chick-fil-A restaurants, and Cracker Barrel restaurants, you would get a nearly perfect predictor of areas that are Democrat versus Republican. We're so polarized. Democrats and Republicans shop at different stores, eat at different restaurants, watch different news. Unfortunately, we seem to be thinking now, hold different facts and beliefs. So we are truly polarized. And this predictability that I suggested here about how the election was going to unfold was a consequence of that polarization. So we get into we get into October. And in October, the candidates are going exactly where we had thought. They are traveling to places like North Carolina, like Florida, the upper Midwest, to Pennsylvania, some trips to Ohio, but largely it flowed out the way it is. I see it. Dustin has a question that I'm going to get to in a couple of minutes, and the answer is going to be yes. The president will be decided by January. I think it's going to be decided by December 14th, and I'll explain why in a few minutes, no later than December 14th. So the election flowed along the way we thought. Additionally, it was even becoming more competitive than those 7 or so states. It reduced down to what? The 3 states that determined the election 4 years ago: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Those 3 states flipping to Donald Trump in 2016 is what gave him the presidency. But it was by razor-thin margins. Across those 3 states, had 85,000 more Democrats voted, Secretary Clinton would be running for her 2nd term right now. These elections were incredibly close. So starting about the 2nd or 3rd week of October, during the general election this year, the campaign reduced itself for both teams down to those 3 states. And then eventually, in about the last week, it reduced itself down to what? Basically Pennsylvania, where the focus was. All this entirely predictable based upon our polarization in our society. Now, all of you are going to turn to me and say, but Professor Schultz, you say everything was predictable. Did you predict that the pandemic was going to hit him, that the economy was going to collapse? Did you predict about George Floyd? And the answer is, of course, no on all 3 grounds. But guess what? On one level, they changed everything, but they changed nothing. That what happened is we are so polarized in this country that our reactions to the pandemic, to George Floyd, to the events surrounding George Floyd, which are both the peaceful protests and the violence, and to the economy, largely became what? Surrogates for what I think this campaign at the presidential level was always going to be about: Donald Trump. 4 years ago, Trump was successful in making 2016 campaign all about a referendum on Hillary Clinton, and he won. 2 years ago, following the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, it became clear, especially, that this was an election about what? A referendum on Donald Trump. And it brought out enormous numbers of college-educated suburban women who helped drive the election. This year, all along, I always knew this was an election, what? A referendum on Donald Trump. That presidents running for a 2nd term, it always is about them. It's always a referendum on them, but even more so. And here is where we get to bring in the pandemic, the economy, George Floyd et al. Because even with those events occurring, they became placeholders for how we think about Donald Trump. That how you viewed the pandemic, how you viewed the economy, how you viewed wearing face masks, all came down to your attitude towards Donald Trump. And so on one level, the pandemic, George Floyd et al. Changed nothing. But where it did have an impact was the pandemic, and in terms of the issue of how we vote. States for years had been expanding their right to vote early before Election Day, moving from the classic absentee ballot, where the only way you could vote in advance if you were ill, if you were unable to make it to the ballot on Election Day. But we had already been liberalizing, already been expanding that right to vote even before the pandemic. And the pandemic put enormous pressure on early voting for states to expand, to go to court to expand. And as it expanded, and this becomes important for understanding the narrative today, Donald Trump criticized that early voting and claimed that it was fraudulent, it's full of fraud, that there were all types of problems with it. But nonetheless, it proceeded. And as we know, of course, approximately 100 million people voted early, which is a remarkable number. And our overall turnout appears to be about somewhere in the 140, 150 million mark, which is the largest number of voters to vote at any one time in United States history. Pretty impressive in terms of it. So we had this sense of predictability of rolling down towards Election Day. But also I should point out, when these early votes were going to be cast, They were in the form of what we still call, I guess, an absentee ballot. And in many states across the country, these ballots are not counted until after the election. They are, by statute, not counted until after the polls have closed. Among those states would have been what? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. So fast forward us to election night. And I know I'm working both radio that night and for a Canadian station. And early on, depending on if you're a Republican or a Democrat, either you were drinking champagne or drinking Pepto-Bismol, and it's not clear which you were drinking. Early on, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia are going for Biden. Then it reverses and are going for Trump. Then we see the Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin going for Biden. Then it goes for Trump. But then, late at night, when many people are thinking Trump has this in the bag, Arizona pops up going for Biden. Something's maybe happening. And then everything changed Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday last week. In these critical swing states, the early ballots came in. And it's important to understand that Donald Trump had heavily criticized this early voting, again, as fraudulent, as corrupt. We knew that the early ballots had been requested from Democratic leaning areas in the country. And what happened is that when the tabulations started coming in on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they were starting to now count those Democratic ballots. Because what we saw on election night was what? Was the information based upon the fact that Republicans were showing up voting on election day, as was entirely predicted, and the Democrats had mailed in their ballots or dropped them off. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday into Saturday, the Democratic votes came in, and lo and behold, what? What wound up happening is that Joe Biden surpassed Donald Trump in several states. Again, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and even in Georgia. And that's the story last week, that by the time we get to last Saturday, last week, Joe Biden has unofficially crawled across the 270 line. The reason why I say unofficially is because what? It's still not official. Technically, the election is not over. Technically, about 2 weeks usually after an election occurs, a state will have what's called a canvassing board. The canvassing board will make any corrections in terms of votes, and count any remaining ballots that had been out there, and then declare a vote count, declare a winner, and oftentimes issue the election certificates. We're not there yet. We're not at that point yet, but it's coming up soon in terms of when these canvassing boards will actually meet. But by the end of last week, Trump had lost his lead in several critical states. Where I think we are now, bringing us up to the present, and I'll talk about the lawsuits, is that, again, as of the 11th of November today, is that Biden has somewhere around 290 or so electoral votes, way more than he needs to win. I suspect very shortly we're going to see Georgia be called for Joe Biden, putting him up to 309 electoral votes, well beyond what he actually needs to be able to win this election. Donald Trump is a fighter, and I give him credit for that. And he's vowed on challenging what's happening. And there are two routes. Route number one, he's going to ask for a recount. Recounts in places like Wisconsin, recounts in places like Georgia. However, recounts don't get you very far. Our experience with recounts, statewide level, they only change the votes by maybe a few hundred at most. Most people who show up to vote are dutiful. They fill out the forms correctly, they do everything right. But sometimes a few of them don't work right. Sometimes the computer, or rather the ballot reading machines don't function properly. Not because they're malfunctioning, it's because idiots like me can't figure out how to fill in the dots very well on the ballots, et cetera, et cetera. So he's going to claim that if we do a recount, it'll shift the results. Again, unlikely there. So Trump has said he's going to sue. What are his likely legal arguments? His strongest legal argument that he's giving is that he said that ballots that were postmarked before Election Day, received and then counted after Election Day, should be thrown out. Why? He says they violate what's called the Federal Uniform Election Day Act, passed in like the 1940s, maybe even earlier, but it basically says that the federal elections must take place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And what Trump's argument is that ballots that were cast legally before Election Day, but nonetheless, and even if they've arrived to the polling places by Election Day, remember, cast before Election Day, but arriving on Election Day, those ballots should not be accepted and be thrown out. It is unlikely Trump's going to prevail on that. That the law that proclaims the day when we're supposed to have a federal election, again, the Federal Uniform Election Act, doesn't preclude states from doing absentee ballots where they don't count them until after the election. In fact, many states won't count the absentees until after the election. I actually know there are some states, when I was growing up, New York State didn't even count the absentees unless it thought that the absentees would affect the outcome of the election. So in many ways, these ballots are his primary argument. They shouldn't be accepted because they were received. Even though they were received on Election Day, he said, guess what? They were being counted after Election Day. Therefore, that's fraud. That's his second argument then. When he says there's widespread voter fraud, that I think is in part what he's referring to, how these ballots are cast. Third, his legal team has argued for other types of fraudulent behavior. That truckloads of ballots were being brought into Philadelphia. I heard one of them where somebody said ballots were being snuck in pizza boxes, completed ones. Somebody else said that ballots were being moved from one state to another. All of this is highly improbable in terms of what's going to happen or what has happened. So the judges have already rebuked the Trump legal team for making all these arguments about the ballots. I don't think he's going to win on the voter fraud issue at the end of the day. The courts have already indicated that they're not persuaded by this argument or it doesn't apply. Another argument that he wants to make then is just what I'm going to call it garden variety fraud. That there's a whole bunch of fraudulent activity going out there. For example, that the poll observers couldn't directly look at the ballot counters as one possibility. The courts have largely rejected those. So that avenue is closed. The last avenue that I can think of that's open out there is the Trump legal team has appealed to Bush v. Gore. Bush v. Gore being the famous 2000 decision where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of George Bush, and in the process argued that trying to ascertain voter intent across county districts, which is what the state was doing during a recount, to actually ascertain that voter preference and having different standards across Florida to determine what the voter intent was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And then because of that, it said there's no more time available to come back with good standards. Election over, that's it. Remember, that's a case about what? About ballot, or rather about voter intent. That is a completely different precedent than the claim here about the issue of fraudulent ballots being submitted or the issues of perhaps trying to, how do I want to say here, of trying to claim that there were in fact more, well, actually, I'll rephrase it and say the Bush v. Gore is really about voter intent and not about the corruption of the ballots or not about fraudulent voting. That might be a more succinct way of describing it here. So it's a different issue. But even if Bush v. Gore applied, and it doesn't, it was also one state with two candidates separated by a very narrow margin of votes. For Trump to prevail at this point, I'm going to presume that sometime in the next few days, Georgia is also awarded to Joe Biden. He'll have 309 electoral votes to win the presidency. He only needs 270. In order for Trump to prevail, he would have to do what? Have to show that that the ballots, there was enough corruption in the system to basically overturn the election in at least 3, if not more states. That is unlikely to happen. So far, the judges have rejected all of his arguments, and in fact, are for those of you who are practicing lawyers, they've gotten close to issuing Rule 11 admonitions against the Trump legal team for bringing essentially near frivolous lawsuits. So I don't see the prospects there of being likely to overturn 4 states. Additionally, even if you can succeed in showing that voter fraud existed, courts are reluctant to overturn elections. You can't rerun an election. And what the courts will generally do is say, okay, how many ballots were fraudulent or otherwise improperly cast, subtract that from the margin of victory, and then make a decision from there. Take an example, for example, such as Wisconsin, where the president, I believe, is up by about 22,000 votes. Let's say for some reason that the president can show 5,000 ballots were fraudulent. Guess what? Trump is still behind by 17,000. Judge is not going to change anything whatsoever. So let's think about this, that the litigation is probably unsuccessful. We also know that with recounts rarely change the statewide vote by more than 300 or 400 votes. That's unlikely to change anything. My own sense is that the litigation strategy, given how many states have to be flipped and given the absence of voter fraud, will be difficult to sustain. Some of you might have seen in Reuters news service or in Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, whichever one you use, that election officials across the country, both Republican and Democrat, are largely rejecting the argument of widespread voter fraud. So when does this all have to end? Well, again, there's some hard dates here. Again, there is the hard date coming up soon of December 8th, 2020. December 8th is by federal law. That date is important because it says that if in fact a state has resolved all of its outstanding election disputes before that date, and then if when Congress meets to count the electoral votes, there's a dispute over a state's electoral votes, Congress has to give presumption of validity to the state's resolution of the electoral votes at that point. This is what's called, in parlance, common language, the safe harbor provision that protects states. Back in Florida 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court halted the recount because it was concerned about what? That if it went on any further, that it would endanger the safe harbor provision. I think any litigation ends by December 8th. If not by then, it ends by when? By December 14th, the casting of the electoral votes across the country. So those become my 2 hard dates of when I think it's going to end in terms of how it's going to play out. And just so you all folks know this, a 3rd hard date now is in the Constitution, January 6th, 2021, when the joint session of Congress meets to review and approve the electoral votes to determine the presidency. And then finally, January 20th, 2021, at noon that day, the Constitution calls for the existing term of the president to end and upon oath of office for the new president's term to begin. And just to play out the trivia, although I don't think it's going to go that far, if by some reason we do not have a president selected by the electors and picked by Congress as a default by January 20th, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 would name, at least temporarily, the Speaker of the House to become acting president. That person is whom? It would be Nancy Pelosi. So that's the basis. Let me take a couple of questions here. What do you think will be the country's reaction if Trump is shown to have won and gets a 2nd term? I'm worried about a division and anger that could rise up. Since I don't think that's going to happen, I'm not worried about it myself. But we do know that the American public is worried about this. We do know that since the pandemic started, by the way, then since George Floyd, gun purchases in the United States have exploded. Pardon any pun there. And in the last few weeks, they've gone up even more. You know, what's interesting is before the election, Democrats were fearful of broad-based voter intimidation at the polls. Republicans were worried about widespread voter fraud at the polls. You know what happened on election day? It was boring. It was really boring. 100 million people voted in advance. Not a lot really happened on election day. I think there's an incredible amount of hype about people getting worried about widespread violence. I'm not persuaded it's going to happen. And if it drags out a few more weeks, unfortunately, with the pandemic raging the way it is, I think people at some point are going to be like, oh, all right, the election's over, time to move on, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, I think it's moving on for a lot of people already at this point. So I'm not too concerned about that myself. Okay, so published here. How can we ensure that provisional ballots and mail ballots aren't counted twice? On what was it? What day last week? It was Wednesday? No, I think it was Thursday last week. They were talking to an election official in Nevada and asking him why it's taking so long to count the ballots. And he came back with a great answer. He said, because we want to get it right. And that's a great answer, because what we found out, and this is why I mentioned the recounts before, is that when we do recounts at the state level, generally the numbers between the initial determination and the recount are less than a couple hundred votes, maybe 200-300 votes. Statistically, this is like 0.0000, whatever like that. We get highly accurate quotes or counts on election night, subject to some marginal corrections. And I say this also because there are incredible protocols in place for when ballots come in, or when provisional ballots come in terms of recorded, opened, counted, and so forth, that there's really not much indication that we're going to see that scenario happen. Okay, I understand that the ballots are being recounted in Georgia. What effect will that have on the election, plus or minus? I also heard, by the way, they're going to hand count them instead, which is going to take a little bit longer, as opposed to refeeding them into the machine. Again, if my scenario is correct here, that I think after this recount, Biden has also won Georgia. He's at 309. That means he's, what, 39 electoral votes above what he needs to win the presidency, which means what? That the president would have to knock away 40 electoral votes from Joe Biden. That's take away from, that's at least 3 states that are in contest or would have to be changed. It's so unlikely that I think that will happen. Now, I think I said to somebody recently, or my blog said, it's mathematically and legally just about impossible. Now, I say just about because all of you are probably lawyers too, or many of you are. You never say never. Listen, I grew up as a Mets fan in New York and never thought they could pull it off back in '69. So you never want to say never. But at the end of the day, it's pretty unlikely. And if you look at the litigation that's going on right now, and what the judges have said, same thing, fairly unlikely that short of something coming up that we don't know about in terms of evidence, that he's going to prevail. Is it legal for states to secede from the Union after a Biden victory? No. I think that's what the Civil War was supposed to be about. That among other things, it was first about slavery, and 2, it was about, as Lincoln said, the preservation of the Union, and saying that states cannot succeed. There's also this famous case. What's it called? Texas versus the United States, I think. No, Texas versus White, I think it is. It's a famous post-Civil War case. I think it's Texas versus White, where it was all about adjudicating claims and about whether or not Texas had actually left the Union during the Civil War. And we created this fiction that said the states in the South never actually left the Union. They were kind of, I don't want to quite say on leave, but they had left the Union. And I think the court's language is to say that states can't leave the Union. It's what, perpetual or something like that, or as long as perpetual is. And so the answer is no. Now, whether or not you want those states to leave, or whether or not you are a state that didn't like Biden and you want to leave, it may be a different story entirely. But from a constitutional perspective, that issue was mostly resolved post-Civil War. And maybe not constitutionally, it might have been resolved by what? By the bullet. We're looking for questions. Does anybody have any? Do you see turnout for Georgia January 5th to be equal to, less than, or greater than November 3rd? Normally it is less, but the amount of money people being poured into along with ramifications. First off, I want to say, here's my prediction for those 2 runoff seats, which are for all the marbles. If the Democrats win both of those seats, it's 50-50 with Kamala Harris as vice president, constitutionally allowed to break the ties. This is for everything, folks. So I am betting that these 2 races down there generate about $100 million in spending. Right now, I would suggest to Bridget that if she probably should leave her job here and get the job of selling television advertising space in Georgia for the next 7 weeks, because it's going to be an incredible amount of money that's going to be spent down there, and with organization and so forth. Normally, I would say that a runoff election will favor the Republicans. I'm still going to potentially say that, but Georgia is at a fascinating tipping point in terms of the fact that I didn't think it was going to tip until 4 years from now, a little bit earlier than I thought. And the fact that the voters are highly motivated, and you're right, all the things are going on here, money, et cetera, et cetera. If I were making a prediction, my best bet is the Republicans pick up both of them. My second bet is it splits. And that's what I really think it is. It's going to be a split where the Democrats pick one, Republicans pick the other. Republicans then, I think, have a 51-49 edge in the U.S. Senate. That's sort of where I'm guessing it's going to be, but this is a tough one to call. Trump's lawyers are being lectured by judges about the validity of their cases. Are they subject to bar disciplinary actions? And that's what I'm wondering. Is that they're coming in. They're making arguments that some judges are suggesting as frivolous, frivolous in terms of, for those of us who remember from civil procedure, Rule 11, sanctionable type of stuff. And so I'm just wondering about that. I don't know if anybody saw, there's an article, and I can't remember where I read it the other day. And one of the complaints that they brought to court, federal court, was that the people who were counting the ballots were talking very quietly like this, as they were doing their job. And the Trump people went to court claiming that the people counting the ballots were talking too softly. And the judge just basically looked at the attorneys and said, "Is this the best you got?" And at some point you have to wonder, in these critical swing states, at some point, do the judges just simply say that you don't bring the stuff to us anymore, or you're on warning for Rule 11s at this point? And that's what I'm sort of wondering at this point. I don't know when it's going to kick in. I think the judges are going to give a lot of leeway because it's a presidential race. But at some point, I think those regular rules that we all learned somewhere in law school are going to kick in again, unless they come up with something really serious. Now, remember, and again, I'm reading some of the same stuff that you're reading in the news also. Like, what was it? The Republicans were coming in and saying that, Trump's lawyers, I say, were coming in saying that they had a postal worker claiming a whole bunch of ballots had been manufactured or something. And now that postal worker did an affidavit and sort of recanted what he had to say. They've had other people sort of giving what the courts are describing right now as hearsay and anecdotal evidence, excuse me, about fraud. Nothing that's really standing up in terms of what would normally would stand up in terms of rules of civil procedure for evidence. And so at some point, they need to get something more. Is it true that is more so good? Is it true that is more so good sportsmanship to transfer power and the president isn't required to do so? And so what would be the path look like if Trump refused to do so? Yeah, I mean, this is a 200-year plus tradition in the United States. Excuse me for a second. Sorry. Where we allow for peaceful transitions of power, where the outgoing president cooperates with the incoming president. Right now, the Trump administration doesn't seem to be cooperating. It's not required, but it's sportsmanship. It's about putting the interests of the country ahead of sort of own personal, personal agendas or something like that. And if he does refuse to cooperate. It of course makes the transition more difficult. But one of the things that has surprised me a little bit this week is how rapidly Biden is moving to try to circumvent that. If you've seen in the news, as I have also, the Biden campaign or transition team has set up numerous task forces, convening people to do what? A task force on the pandemic, a task force on a whole bunch of other things. There's been items in Reuters news service and other places pointing out the fact that that Biden is ready with at least 20 executive orders to sign on the very first day to reverse some of the Trump stuff. And what seems really interesting, remember the new Congress gets not signed and sworn in on January 3rd. And what Biden is talking about is what? Negotiating before he gets sworn in as president on January 20th, negotiating with the incoming the new Congress on a variety of things. This essentially is what? Trying to make the outgoing Trump administration irrelevant and almost creating what? A shadow government to operate. So the Biden team, I think, is trying to address these issues. Are federal prosecutors opposed to advancing voter fraud? I don't think they would be if they could actually, again, coming back to it, if they had hard evidence to be able to bring. At the end of the day, I'm going to say 99% plus of federal prosecutors are playing it nonpartisanly, are trying to do their jobs. And if they come across with what is legitimate evidence of voter fraud, they will prosecute. But so far, again, and what we get every 4 years is just it's really almost marginal across the country. A lot of times people who vote twice do so because what? They were confused or something like that. And this year, I have to think people might be confused even more about the pandemic. Right. But now I've got to tell you a funny story on the side, though. Right. I'm also an election law professor, and I'm teaching my election law seminar this semester. And there's always the joke, of course, about the dead voting. Well, this is really interesting that I didn't know until this year, is that think about a scenario where we've had 100 million people vote before Election Day. What if somebody, following the laws of their state, voted, let's say, 10 days before the election, mailed in their ballot, but then they die and they're dead on Election Day? Should their ballot count? And one of my students is researching this, and in many states, yes, if you cast your ballot legally before Election Day, but you nonetheless have died and you're not alive on Election Day, about 20 states still count your ballot. About 20 states say, no, you can't. And there's a bunch of states that really don't talk about it one way or the other. And I just mention this because, all jokes aside about, the dead voting, this is actually a fascinating legal question to think about it here, is that, again, if you have legally were entitled to vote early, do you actually have to be alive on Election Day to have your ballot counted? And some states have resolved it one way versus another. Now, Bridget's asking me a question. Can I talk a bit about the electors and whether some could still vote contrary to their pledge? Are there states that still allow this, and are they relevant to this election? Okay, there is a concern about what's called the faithless elector, that over time we have had about I think the total number is, with all the presidential elections, about 10,000 electoral votes cast, like 10,500, 11,000. Don't quote me on the exact number, but that's an approximate. And we've had about 90 of them who would be fitting to the category is what we call faithless, not voting according to the way the popular vote went in their state. And several states concerned about this have passed faithless elector laws that say that if you vote contrary to the popular vote in your state, either you will be excluded from being able to vote and have an alternate vote for you instead, or you can be fined heavily for doing that. That's about, I think, 6 or 7 states that have those faithless elector laws. So a lot of states still allow electors to kind of vote their conscience, but the reality is most of them wind up doing what? Voting the way the popular vote went in that state. And given the fact that electors are really chosen by the candidates. What happens in all 50 states is the state legislature basically says to each of the presidential candidates who's qualified in their state, you get to designate a team of electors. And if you win, your team gets to cast the electoral votes in the state. Because these individuals are more or less chosen by the candidates, the reality is very few are faithless. Having said that, 4 years ago, I'm in the state of Minnesota. I'm in St. Paul, and I decided for the first time in my life to go watch the casting of the electoral votes in the state of Minnesota, and it was actually kind of cool. It's noon on electoral college voting day, and it's kind of this big, bloated ceremony where the Secretary of State comes out. They have the pomp and the circumstance, and people are calling the names out of the people. And Hillary Clinton had won this state, and so they got to one of the electors and they said, how cast ye your vote, or something in old English like that. And he says, for Bernie Sanders, which is not how it's supposed to go. Minnesota is one of those states that have a faithless elector law, and the Secretary of State, you step to the side. That person was forced off to the side, and his substitute came in and cast the vote for Hillary Clinton. So I not only did I get to see the Electoral College vote in my state, but I saw a faithless elector and the faithless elector law kick in. It was all pretty cool to kind of watch this. Probably can't do it again this year because of the pandemic, but needless to say. Anyhow, there's been so few that it probably doesn't really matter in terms of this election. But I'll just give you a couple of trivia questions here. The last time a faithless elector voted for the candidate, for the opposite candidate, let's say the opposite party candidate, was in 1796. Somebody who was supposed to vote for John Adams instead voted for Thomas Jefferson. That shows you how long that is. Isn't that a great trivia question to know, or something like that? I think it's pretty cool.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's the end of the questions. I'm going to sum up here, but David, thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation. I very much enjoyed it. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We would like to invite you to learn more about voting laws in the United States on our site at FindLaw.com/voting. We'll send an email with this recording, and then our top voting law content will be linked in there. Please pass this presentation along to anyone who you think might be interested. And then if you enjoyed the presentation today, we encourage you to listen to our interviews with Professor Schultz on the Electoral College, so he'll dive more into what he was just discussing, and then also on the history of voting rights, which both were fascinating discussions. So please peruse those. All right, thanks again for attending this webinar, and we really hope you have a great rest of the day. And Professor Schultz, thanks again.
My pleasure, thank you.